It was supposed to be a simple drive home. I had taken that route 1,000 times before, always passing mile marker 42 without a second thought. But that night was different. The air was thick with fog, the kind that clings to your skin and muffles sound. I was driving slowly, my headlights barely cutting through the mist. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping on my window. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the car, but there were no trees near the road. My pulse quickened. I glanced at the window, expecting to see nothing. Instead, I saw a shape, just a shadow at first, but as I slowed down, it became clearer. A hand, pale and bony, pressed against the glass. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the tapping anymore. Who was out there? Why were they following me? I wanted to keep driving. Every instinct screamed at me to hit the gas and not look back, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the sheer terror of not knowing. Against my better judgment, I pulled over near the mile marker. The tapping stopped as soon as I killed the engine. The silence was deafening. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Finally, I stepped out, my breath visible in the cold air. The road was empty, no cars, no people, just me and the fog. And then I saw it on the ground, just a few feet away from my car. A picture frame, cracked, old, and weathered. I picked it up, and the blood drained from my face. It was my face, staring back at me from a photograph I had never taken. My hands shook as I held the frame. The photo was strange, grainy, almost like it had been taken decades ago. But it was unmistakably me, wearing clothes I didn't recognize, standing in a place I had never been. I flipped the frame over, searching for a clue, a name, anything that could explain what this was. There was nothing but a single word scrawled on the back of the photo in faded ink. Run. My stomach twisted. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the fog, chilling me to the bone. I turned back to my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I froze. In the fogged-up window, there was a handprint, fresh, too large to be mine. Panic set in. I jumped into the car and locked the doors, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled to start the engine. The car roared to life, and I floored the gas. The mile marker disappeared into the fog behind me, but the dread didn't fade. That's when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, on the back window. I didn't dare look. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly I thought I might snap it in half. The tapping turned into pounding, and then silence. I glanced in the mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. A figure was sitting in the back seat, face obscured by shadows, but those pale, bony hands, they were unmistakable. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The force threw me forward, and when I whipped around, the back seat was empty. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed the frame, now lying on the passenger seat. The photo had changed. It wasn't just me anymore. There was someone standing behind me in the picture. A man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. My skin crawled as I realized he was wearing the same clothes as the figure I had just seen in my car. I hurled the frame out the window and slammed on the gas, desperate to get as far away as possible. As I sped down the road, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I grabbed it, hoping for a distraction, and saw a notification from an unknown number. The message was short. "You can't outrun me." My stomach lurched. The tapping resumed, this time on the windshield. I screamed, swerving wildly, but no matter how fast I drove, the sound followed me. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the road ahead. And then I saw them. Mile markers. Dozens of them, all with the number 42, stretching endlessly into the distance. I was trapped. The road, the fog, the tapping, it all felt like some kind of sick loop I couldn't escape. My car sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of the endless fog. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I sat there, frozen, until I noticed the frame lying on the dashboard. The photo had changed again. This time, it showed my car, surrounded by the fog, with me inside. And then the figure appeared in the driver's seat of the photo. My chest tightened as I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned, and there he was, hollow eyes, twisted smile, inches from my face. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own scream as everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at mile marker 42, the cracked frame in my lap, the road empty. But now the photo showed you. I swear, I still don't understand what really happened that night. I've replayed it 1,000 times in my head, and no matter how I try to rationalize it, it just doesn't make sense. It started on a stormy night. My buddy Chris and I were driving back from a weekend camping trip in the mountains. The rain had turned the highway into a slick, glistening mess, and visibility was terrible. The kind of night where every shadow feels alive, and every turn in the road feels like it could be your last. Chris, ever the joker, kept trying to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about horror movies set on rainy highways. But even he was gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights caught a small roadside diner. Its neon sign buzzed weakly, spelling out the word open like a promise. We hadn't seen another building or another car for miles, and hunger gnawed at both of us. So we decided to stop. The diner was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own footsteps sound deafening. There was no music, no chatter, just the faint clinking of a coffee cup against the counter. And then there was him. A man sat at the counter, dressed in a dark coat that seemed a size too big. He had this warm smile, the kind that instantly makes you feel at ease, like he was someone's favorite grandpa. He turned to us as we walked in, and his eyes seemed to sparkle like he knew we were coming. "Storm's bad tonight," he said, his voice calm, almost melodic. "You boys better be careful on these roads." Chris and I sat at a booth, and the waitress, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere but here, served us coffee and pie. The man at the counter kept glancing at us like he wanted to say more. Finally, he stood up, walked over to our table, and leaned in a little. "There's a sharp turn about 5 miles up the road. Dangerous spot, especially on nights like this. You slow down there, you hear?" We nodded politely, thanked him, and he returned to his seat. Something about him was odd. Not creepy exactly, but unsettling in a way I couldn't put my finger on. He seemed too familiar. We should have known him. But we didn't. We left the diner and got back on the highway. The rain hadn't let up. It was coming down even harder now. Chris, taking the man's advice to heart, slowed down as we approached what looked like a sharp curve ahead. That's when we saw it. A massive semi-truck barreling towards us in the opposite lane, its headlights glaring like twin suns. Its tires skidded on the wet pavement, and it started veering into our lane. Chris slammed on the brakes. The car fishtailed, but because he had slowed down, we managed to stop just inches from the truck. The semi roared past us, its horn blaring like some kind of demonic scream. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. If we hadn't slowed down, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. We pulled over to catch our breath, and as we sat there in stunned silence, I thought about the man at the diner. How had he known? How could he have possibly known? A few miles later, we saw the warm glow of a gas station. We pulled in, needing a break and some air after the near-death experience. The place was run down, the kind of gas station where you half expect the power to go out mid-transaction. While Chris filled the tank, I wandered inside. The clerk barely looked up as I grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter. That's when I saw it. A bulletin board next to the register, plastered with missing persons flyers. And there, right in the middle, was his face, the man from the diner. "Hey," I called out to the clerk, my voice shaking. "This guy, does he work around here?" The clerk glanced at the flyer and shook his head. "Nope, he's been missing for months. Disappeared back in June. Real shame, too. Nice guy." My blood ran cold. Missing for months? That wasn't possible. I'd just seen him. We'd talked to him. He'd saved our lives. Chris came in just then, and I grabbed his arm, pulling him over to the board. "Chris, look," I said, pointing at the flyer. "That's him, the guy from the diner." Chris froze, his face going pale. "No way," he whispered. "That's impossible." We left the gas station in a daze, our minds racing. Neither of us could explain it. The man had been real, or at least he seemed real. But how could someone who's been missing for months warn us about that curve? How could he just vanish? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that warm smile, those knowing eyes. And then, the missing persons poster. Chris and I never spoke about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that diner. I think about the truck. I think about the man who saved our lives. And I wonder, was he trying to warn us? Or was he trying to finish what had started, the night he disappeared? To this day, I don't know what we encountered. But if you're ever driving on a stormy night and find yourself in a roadside diner, pay attention. Because you never know who, or what, might be sitting at the counter. What do you think happened that night? Let me know in the comments below. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. My wife, Sarah, and I were driving through a desolate stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but thick woods and the eerie silence of the countryside. We were coming back from a weekend getaway, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving us under a blanket of darkness. The only sound was the hum of our car's engine and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the trees. Then, out of nowhere, we saw it. A small figure standing by the roadside. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, wearing a tattered white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the headlights. She wasn't crying or waving for help. She just stood there, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. My heart instantly started racing. What was a child doing out here, alone in the middle of nowhere? "Stop the car," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I pulled over, my hands shaking on the wheel. The girl didn't move. She just kept staring at us. Something about her stillness, her silence, was deeply unsettling. But the thought of leaving her there, all alone, was unthinkable. I stepped out of the car, calling out, "Hey there, are you okay? Are you lost?" My voice sounded weak, almost swallowed by the oppressive silence of the night. The girl didn't answer. She turned slowly and walked into the woods, her bare feet making no sound against the gravel. Sarah shouted, "We can't just leave her." And I nodded, my gut twisting with unease. We followed her, our flashlights cutting through the dark, only to discover she was gone, completely vanished. But there, on the forest floor, were tiny footprints leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, we decided to follow the footprints. Something about the situation felt wrong, unnatural even, but we couldn't ignore the possibility that a child might be in danger. The woods swallowed us whole as we ventured further in. The canopy above was so dense that even the moonlight couldn't penetrate. Our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. The footprints were bizarre. They were too perfect, too precise, like they'd been stamped onto the ground rather than made by an actual child. "This doesn't feel right," Sarah muttered, clutching my arm. I agreed, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Every step deeper into the woods made my skin crawl, but we kept going. We had to. Then we heard it. A soft giggle, like the kind you'd hear from a child playing hide-and-seek. It came from ahead, echoing eerily between the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. We called out again, pleading for the girl to come out, but there was no response. Just more giggling, now coming from a different direction. Panic began to set in. The footprints had led us into a small clearing, but there was no sign of the child. Instead, the air felt heavy, oppressive, like we were being watched. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "We need to go back," she said, her voice trembling. But just as we turned to leave, we saw another set of footprints, larger this time, appearing in the dirt behind us, as if someone, or something, had been following us. My heart sank as I realized we weren't alone. The larger footprints were fresh, their edges crisp against the soil. They didn't belong to us, and they definitely weren't the child's. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking. The only response was the rustling of leaves, as if something was circling us just out of sight. Sarah clung to me, her flashlight beam shaking wildly as she scanned the trees. "This isn't right. We have to leave now," she pleaded. I nodded, finally giving in to the overwhelming sense of dread. But when we turned to retrace our steps, the path we'd taken was gone. The woods had shifted, closing in around us like a living, breathing thing. We stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find our way back to the car. But no matter which direction we went, we kept ending up in the same clearing. It was as if the forest was toying with us, trapping us in an endless loop. The giggling started again, louder this time, echoing from every direction. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was several, overlapping and distorted, like a chorus of children mocking us. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the trees themselves. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into near total darkness. Sarah's flashlight was the only source of light now, and its beam was growing weaker by the second. "We're not alone," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. And she was right. We could feel it. A presence, something unseen but undeniably there, watching us from the shadows. We froze, paralyzed by the weight of the unseen presence. The air around us grew colder, and the giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. That's when we saw them. Pairs of glowing eyes appearing in the darkness, surrounding us. They weren't human. They were too large, too bright, and they blinked in unison, as if connected by some unseen force. Sarah gripped my arm so tightly it hurt. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, searching for any logical explanation, but there was none. This wasn't natural. This wasn't something we were meant to understand. The eyes moved closer, and with them came a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. Sarah screamed, and in that moment, pure instinct took over. I grabbed her hand and we ran. Blindly, desperately, we plunged through the trees, branches clawing at our faces and arms. The growling grew louder, chasing us, and the glowing eyes followed, darting between the trees like fireflies from hell. We burst into another clearing and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. For a moment, it seemed like we'd lost them. But then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the darkness. A figure emerged into the faint beam of Sarah's flashlight. It was the child. But her face was wrong. Her eyes were hollow voids, and her smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I felt like my mind was breaking. The girl stood there, staring at us with that unnatural grin. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to pulse with malevolence. Sarah was sobbing, clutching at me, but I couldn't look away. It was like she was holding us in place with her gaze. Then she pointed. Her small, pale hand lifted, and she pointed to the ground in front of her. At first, I didn't understand, but then the earth began to shift, the dirt churning as if something beneath it was trying to break free. A skeletal hand emerged, clawing its way to the surface, and then we watched in horror as figures began to rise from the ground. They were humanoid but twisted and wrong, their bodies gaunt and their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Their empty eyes locked onto us, and their mouths opened in silent screams. The child giggled again, and the sound was like nails on a chalkboard, piercing and unbearable. "Run!" I screamed, pulling Sarah to her feet. We bolted, not caring where we were going, just desperate to get away. The creatures gave chase, their movements unnaturally fast, their limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. The forest seemed alive, branches reaching out to snag us, roots tripping us up. It was as if the whole world was conspiring to keep us there. By some miracle, we found the road again. Our car was still there, parked on the shoulder, its headlights cutting through the darkness. We didn't stop to think. We threw ourselves into the car, locking the doors and fumbling to start the engine. The creatures were still coming, their glowing eyes visible in the rearview mirror as they closed the distance. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched, and we sped down the road, leaving the horrors of the forest behind. But even as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. The air in the car felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, as if something had followed us. Sarah was shaking uncontrollably, her hands clutching the dashboard. "What was that?" she kept repeating, her voice filled with terror. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had to keep going, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever we'd encountered. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her, the girl. She was standing in the middle of the road, watching us as we disappeared into the night. And even though we were miles away from the forest, I could still hear her laughter, faint but unmistakable, echoing in my ears. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, a small, quiet place that felt like a haven after what we'd been through. We checked into a motel and locked ourselves in, too shaken to sleep. Sarah kept the lights on, her eyes darting to the windows every few seconds, as if expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at her. The next morning, we reported what had happened to the local authorities. They listened politely, but clearly didn't believe us. "That stretch of road has always been strange," one officer said, almost casually. "Locals say it's haunted. Lots of stories about people seeing things out there, but nothing's ever been proven." Haunted. The word felt insufficient to describe what we'd experienced. This wasn't just a ghost story or a trick of the mind. It was real. Too real. And it had left scars that wouldn't heal. Even now, weeks later, I can't close my eyes without seeing that girl's face or hearing her laughter. We've vowed never to take that road again, no matter what. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of giggling, faint and distant, as if carried on the wind, and I'll wonder, did we really escape, or did we bring something back with us?